Chapter 1. The Cry in the Wind. The late afternoon sun hung low over Dry Creek, bleeding gold across the horizon and turning the dust into drifting clouds of fire. Colt Lawson's boots crunched in the dirt as he made his way down the narrow alley behind the saloon, the scent of stale whiskey and with smoke lingering in the air. His spurs clinked with each step, a steady rhythm in the quiet, until something broke it. A sound, soft but jagged at the edges. A sob. He stopped. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling between the warped boards of the buildings. But then it came again, low, muffled, and aching in a way that prickled the back of his neck. Colt shifted his weight, scanning the narrow passage between the saloon and the old feed store. Only the creak of the water pump and the distant laughter from the saloon's front room kept the silence company. He followed the sound. It led him to a leaning outhouse at the very end of the lane, its door half closed and swaying on a loose hinge. "Hello," Colt called, his voice low, careful not to spook whoever was inside. The sobbing stopped. Colt stepped closer, the dust whispering under his boots. He pushed the door just enough to see inside. In the dim, stuffy space sat a young woman. Skirts crumpled beneath her, a baby bundled in her arms. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and her chest rose and felt like she'd run a long way. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny hand clutching at the fabric of her bodice. Colt's hat tipped forward as he crouched, his tall frame folding to meet her eye level. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you all right?" She shook her head, quick and sharp, as though the question itself hurt. The outhouse was stifling, the air thick with heat and the faint scent of cedar from the warped boards. Her knuckles were white where they gripped the child. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, "just leave us be." Colt studied her, mud on her hem, a bruise shadowing her cheekbone, the way her gaze darted toward the street like she feared someone might find her here. "I can't do that," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Not when you're sitting in here like this." Her lips pressed tight, and for a moment he thought she'd tell him to go to hell. But the baby fussed again, a plaintive cry that seemed to break something in her. Her shoulders sagged. Colt reached for the door, letting more light spill in, though the glare made her flinch. "Name's Colt Lawson," he said, resting one hand against the frame. "Ain't here to hurt you. Ain't here to judge you neither." Her eyes flicked up to his, searching for some trick in his words. "Clara May," she murmured finally. This is Luke." Colt gave a slow nod. "Clara May and Luke," he repeated, like he was committing them to memory. A horse whinnied somewhere on Main Street. From the saloon came the sharp clink of glasses, followed by a burst of drunken laughter. Colt glanced over his shoulder toward the sound before turning back. "You can't stay in here," he said, voice low. "Not with the sun dropping and the cold coming in. Folks might not be kind, but I'll see you're safe." Tears welled fresh in her eyes, and she shook her head as though safety were a word she no longer believed in. Colt set his jaw. "You'll never cry here again," he told her. The words left him steady as stone, but something in him felt like a promise bigger than he'd meant to give. She blinked at him, the fight in her gaze wavering. Colt extended a calloused hand. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant windmill creaking and the baby's soft breathing. Then, slowly, she shifted Luke against her shoulder and placed her free hand in his. Colt helped her to her feet, steadying her as she stumbled out into the fading sunlight. The world outside was still the same, dust drifting down the street, the air tinged with smoke and the echo of a piano from the saloon. But for Clara May it felt different, warmer somehow. Colt tipped his hat toward her and the baby, then began leading them away from the outhouse and toward whatever came next. And though she didn't know it yet, Clara May had just stepped into the first chapter of a life that might not be easy, but would never again be lonely in the same way. Chapter 2. A Town's Cruel Eyes. The late-day sun had slipped lower, casting long shadows down Dry Creek's main street as Colt led Clara May and her baby from the back alley toward open ground. The boards beneath their boots groaned as they stepped up onto the boardwalk, and the street's chatter began to fade, not because the day was ending, but because people were watching. Colt felt it first, the weight of eyes. Men leaning against the saloon's porch rail slowed their idle talk. A pair of women carrying baskets paused mid-step, whispering behind gloved hands. Even the blacksmith, hammer raised over the anvil, glanced up as the three of them crossed the street. Clara May clutched Luke closer, her head ducked low beneath the rim of a faded bonnet. The baby squirmed against her shoulder, letting out a small whimper, but she shushed him quickly, as if afraid his cries would draw more attention. Colt's jaw tightened. He'd seen the look before, the slow, measuring stare of folks who believed they knew the whole story just from the sight of a woman and a child without a man. They reached the saloon, its swinging doors spilling light and noise into the cool air. Cards slapped against the table somewhere inside, followed by a roar of laughter and the faint twang of a fiddle. Colt Lawson, a voice drawled from the shadows of the porch. Colt turned his head, meeting the smug gaze of Deputy Harris, lounging in a chair with his boots propped against the railing. His badge caught a glint of the fading sunlight, but his eyes held no law, only lazy amusement. "You've found yourself quite the sight," Harris said, letting his gaze slide openly over Clara May in a way that made her stiffen. "Ain't every day a man brings home strays." Colt stepped forward, planting himself between Harris's stare and Clara. "She's a guest," he said, his voice calm but edged. Harris smirked. "Guest, huh? Folks'll talk. They already are." "Let him," Colt said, his tone low final. Harris leaned forward, boots thudding to the porch floor. "Careful, Lawson. This town's memory is long, and it don't take kindly to outsiders thinking they belong." His eyes flicked to Clara again, then to the baby, especially the kind that come back with trouble attached. Colt held his gaze until Harris looked away, spitting into the street before pushing to his feet and heading inside. The saloon swallowed him whole, but his words lingered like smoke. Clara shifted beside him. "You shouldn't," she began, but Colt cut her off gently. "I should. Nobody talks to you like that while I'm standing here." Her eyes searched his face, confusion and something warmer, gratitude, maybe, fighting with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. They kept walking, the rattle of wagon wheels and the scent of horse sweat filling the air. Colt didn't need to look around to know the eyes were still on them, following every step. As they neared the edge of town, Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet. "They don't know me. They don't know what happened. They don't need to," Colt said. "And I ain't going to let him decide who you are." The last of the sunlight bled out over the prairie, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Clara glanced back once, seeing the saloon lights flicker against the deepening night. Then she turned forward, matching her steps to Colt's, and for the first time since leaving that outhouse, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he'd said. Chapter 3. Shelter under his roof. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and quiet except for the wind sighing through the tall grass. By the time Colt and Clara reached the split-rail fence marking the edge of his land, the sun had dipped low, and the first cool breath of night touched the air. Colt's ranch came into view over the rise, a weathered two-story house with white paint worn down to gray, a big red barn to its left, and the slow, steady spin of a windmill silhouetted against the violet sky. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying with it the warm scent of mesquite and wood fire. Clara shifted Luke in her arms. He had fallen asleep on the ride, his small cheek pressed against her shoulder. "It's big," she murmured, as if speaking too loud might wake him. "Been in my family a long time," Colt said. His voice carried a note of quiet pride. "It's not much to look at, but it'll keep you warm." As they rode into the yard, The front door swung open. Miss Lila, a stout woman with silver hair pinned back in a bun, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Clara. "Evening, Colt," she said slowly, gaze flicking from him to the woman cradling the baby. "You bringin' strays home now?" Colt dismounted, the creak of leather breaking the silence. "This here's Clara May, and the little one's Luke. They'll be stayin' for a spell." Miss Lila's brows arched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped forward and reached for Clara's bundle of belongings, little more than a worn satchel and the thin shawl around her shoulders. "Well, no sense standing out in the cold. Come on in, dear." Clara hesitated, eyes darting to Colt. He gave a small nod, and she followed Miss Lila up the steps, her boots thumping softly on the worn boards. Inside, the house smelled of fresh bread and stew simmering over the stove. The flicker of lamplight danced across the wooden walls, casting the place in a golden glow. Clara stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to move farther, but Luke stirred and whimpered in his sleep. "Here," Miss Lila said, ushering her toward a wide chair near the hearth. "Sit. Warm yourself." Clara lowered into the chair, the heat from the fire seeping into her bones. Colt stepped inside behind her, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg. "You look half frozen," Miss Lila fussed, laying a folded quilt across Clara's lap. "I'll fetch you something hot." Clara brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, her fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the strange, unfamiliar sense of safety wrapping around her. She kept glancing toward the door, half expecting it to burst open and the world outside to crash in. Colt caught the look and crouched beside her chair. "No one's coming for you here," he said quietly, his gaze steady. Her throat tightened. "You don't know that." "I do." His tone was firm but not unkind, and something in his eyes made her believe him, if only for a moment. Miss Lila returned with 2 steaming bowls and set them on the table. "Eat," she ordered. "Both of you." Colt pulled a chair close to the fire, his presence solid, like a wall between her and everything that had hurt her. Outside, the windmill creaked in the night breeze, and somewhere far off, a coyote called to the dark. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara let herself exhale. Chapter 4. Whispers on the Prairie. Morning on Colt Lawson's ranch broke with a sky the color of pale gold, the sun stretching long fingers of light over the rolling grasslands. Clara May stood on the back porch with Luke on her hip, breathing the scent of fresh dew and the faint tang of manure from a nearby corral. The air here felt different, wide and clean, as though the land itself had enough space to hold her worries. But peace in the prairie didn't keep the world from talking. Miss Lila came out carrying a basket of linens to hang, her face pinched in that way it did when she had news. "Went into town early for flour," she said, pinning a sheet to the line. "Couldn't walk a dozen steps without hearing your name." Clara's fingers tightened on the baby. "What are they saying? That you're shacked up with Colt? That you came here without a ring or a respectable story?" And Miss Lila hesitated, glancing toward the barn where Colt was working. "That you were abandoned for good reason." Clara felt a sting in her chest, sharper than the morning chill. "I didn't come here be someone's scandal." Miss Lila's hand stilled. "Scandal fades, dear, but survival, that's worth the noise." The barn door swung open then, and Colt emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. His hat shadowed his face, but even from here, Clara could see the steel in his gaze. He must have overheard. "They can talk themselves hoarse," Colt said, striding over. "Doesn't make 'em right." Clara wanted to believe him, but the memory of years of whispers, back in her hometown, in the places she'd stopped along the way, clung like burrs. She looked away, shifting Luke higher in her arms. That afternoon, she helped Miss Lila with the washing out by the pump. The sun was high, warm on her shoulders, and for a fleeting moment she caught herself humming a tune she used to sing as a girl. She didn't notice Colt leaning against the fence, watching her. His eyes followed the curve of her smile, the sunlight catching in the loose strands of her hair. There was something unguarded in her in that moment, and it caught him off guard. He'd been careful, real careful, not to look at her too long, not to let his thoughts wander. But out here, with the wind carrying the scent of wild sage and the slow creak of the pump handle in the air, the distance he'd kept began to feel thin. Clara felt it too. When she glanced up and found his gaze, the air between them thickened. She looked away first, pretending to busy herself with the laundry, but her pulse beat hard in her throat. That evening, as the sun slid behind the distant hills and painted the horizon in streaks of copper and crimson, Colt saddled his horse for a quick ride to check the southern fence line. Clara stood on the porch, rocking Luke, and caught herself watching him go. The townsfolk might have their whispers, but out here, under the vast western sky, their words seemed small, almost powerless. And for the first time, Clara wondered if maybe she wasn't just passing through. Chapter 5. The Man Who Left Her. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying with it the scent of rain and something heavier, trouble. Colt noticed it in town that morning, the way conversation dipped when he walked past, the way eyes slid away too quickly. By the time he finished loading supplies into the wagon, he knew why. A stranger stepped out of the telegraph office, hat pulled low, a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Colt recognized him. Sam Tully, a drifter with a knack for knowing everyone's business before they did. "You hear the news, Lawson?" Sam asked, leaning one arm on the wagon's edge. "Jeb Hollister's riding back. Should be here before the week's out." Colt's hand stilled on the reins. "You sure?" "Sure as the dust dry. Man's been in Dead Horse Gulch these past months. Says he's coming to claim what's his." Sam's grin sharpened. "That woman out at your ranch, she's his, ain't she?" Colt didn't answer. His eyes narrowed just enough to make Sam step back. "Best keep your mouth shut, Tully," Colt said, his voice low. "For your own sake." By the time he rode back to the ranch, a heavy knot had formed in his gut. Clara was on the porch, rocking Luke, the warm light from inside spilling across her face. She smiled when she saw him. Just a small thing, but enough to twist that knot tighter. "Something happened?" she asked as he dismounted. Colt's boots thudded against the boards as he came up the steps. "We need to talk." Her smile faded. "What is it?" He rested a hand on the porch post, watching her carefully. "Jeb's coming back." The color drained from her face. Luke stirred in her arms, sensing the sudden tension. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, he can't." "He can try," Colt said, cutting in gently but firmly. "But he won't take you. Or the boy." Her breathing quickened, her arms tightening protectively around Luke. "You don't know him, Colt. He's mean when he drinks. And when he don't get what he wants," she trailed off, eyes darting to the horizon, as though Jeb might ride up out of the twilight any moment. Colt stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "I've faced worse than a drunk with a short temper. You're staying here, under my roof. I'll see to it he never lays a hand on you again." Her gaze flicked to his, and for a heartbeat she looked like she wanted to believe him, but fear clung to her, thick as smoke. Later that night, after Luke was asleep, Clara stood at the window of her small room, staring out at the moonlit prairie. The windmill creaked in the distance, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled. She thought of the years she'd spent with Jeb, of the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of the way his voice could turn her to stone. Then she thought of Colt's voice earlier, steady as the land beneath her feet. Down in the yard, she saw him moving between the barn and the corral, checking the gate latches, making sure the lanterns were out. He moved like a man expecting trouble, but not fearing it. And for the first time since hearing Jeb's name again, Clara's fear was joined by something else. Hope. Chapter 6. Gunpowder at Dawn. The sky was just beginning to pale, the first faint brush of light touching the rooftops of Dry Creek. The air was cold enough to bite, the kind of morning when breath hung like smoke and every sound carried farther than it should. Colt Lawson stepped into the middle of Main Street, the grit of the earth grinding beneath his boots. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, his duster flapping faintly in the breeze. Somewhere behind him, a saloon door creaked open, then slammed shut again as the early risers realized what was about to unfold. Jeb Hollister was already there. He stood a few paces away, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered but cruel, a jagged scar cut from the corner of his mouth down to his jaw, and his eyes were the same hard gray as a thunderhead rolling in. The whiskey on his breath was strong enough Colt could smell it from here. "That's my wife you've been keeping out at your place, Lawson," Jeb said, voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "And my boy." Colt's voice was steady, measured. "You left them. They ain't yours anymore." Jeb's jaw flexed. "Ain't up to you. You hand 'em over now and I'll walk away." Colt didn't move. "You'll never lay a hand on either of 'em again. That's the only deal you're getting." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Farmers, shopkeepers, even the blacksmith's apprentice, all watching from porches and windows. They knew this was about to turn. Jeb sneered. "You think you can stand between me and what's mine?" His hand hovered near the worn leather of his holster. Colt's gaze didn't waver. "I know I can." The tension was thick enough to choke on. A dog barked somewhere down the street, sharp and quick, then silence fell again. Jeb moved first. His hand went for the Colt .45 on his hip, but Lawson was faster. The crack of the gunshot split the morning wide open, echoing off the buildings. Jeb's pistol spun from his grasp, clattering into the dirt. He staggered back, clutching his hand where blood already seeped between his fingers. Gasps broke from the crowd, but no one stepped forward to help him. Colt kept his gun leveled, his eyes locked on Jeb. "Get on your horse. You ride out of here, and you don't come back." Jeb's glare was full of hate, but behind it was something else. Calculation. He knew the town was watching. He knew he'd lost this fight. With a curse, he turned, cradling his injured hand, and climbed into the saddle. His horse tossed its head, hoofs kicking up dust as he rode out, disappearing into the morning haze. The street stayed quiet for a long moment after he was gone, the only sound the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. Then someone muttered, "Lawson did right." And the tension cracked like thin ice. Colt holstered his gun and turned toward the edge of the street, where Clara stood half hidden in the shadow of the Mercantile's porch. She was pale, her hands clenched together, but her eyes were fixed on him, not with fear, but something else entirely. He walked to her, stopping just close enough that their boots nearly touched. "It's over," he said softly. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. With Jeb, it's never over. Colt's gaze hardened, but there was a quiet promise in it, too. "Then I'll be here every time." And in the chill of that dawn, with the crowd melting away and the dust settling, Clara knew he meant it. Chapter 7. Hearts Laid Bare. The night after the gunfight came quiet. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that sat heavy, like the whole prairie was holding its breath. Out at the ranch, the windmill groaned in the darkness, turning slow and steady. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low, painting the walls with flickers of orange light. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands cupped around a mug of tea she'd barely touched. Luke was asleep upstairs, safer now, but her mind kept replaying the moment she'd seen Jeb on Main Street, the way his shadow had stretched across the dirt like something from a nightmare. Colt came in from the barn, the door clicking shut behind him. He'd stabled the horses, checked the gates again. He moved like a man who could rest only if he'd left no opening for trouble. His hat hung low until he set it on the peg by the door. "You should be in bed," he said, voice low. She looked down into her tea. Couldn't sleep. Colt pulled out the chair across from her and sat, leaning forward on his forearms. "He's not coming back tonight." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know Jeb." "I know the type," Colt said. "And I know the look in a man's eyes when he's been beat in front of a crowd. He'll lick his wounds before he tries again." For a while, the only sound was the wind against the house. Clara's hands tightened around the mug. He wasn't always like that. When I first met him, he could charm a preacher's wife. I thought... She stopped, shaking her head. Didn't take long for the drink to show me who he really was. And by then, I had Luke. Colt didn't interrupt. He'd just listen, his gaze steady on her. He'd tell me I was worthless, that no one else would have me. And every time I tried to stand up to him, she'd glance away, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, you've seen the bruises." Colt's jaw tightened. "A man like that doesn't deserve the ground he walks on." She gave a humorless laugh. "I used to dream about leaving, but every road I pictured led somewhere worse. Until the day he did it for me, left me and Luke behind without a coin or a word." She met his eyes then, the firelight catching in hers. "I thought that was the end of the world. Maybe it wasn't." Colt's hand moved across the table, slow, like he didn't want to spook her, when his rough, callous fingers closed over hers. She felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I lost my wife and boy," he said quietly. "Fever took him quick as a prairie storm. After that, I swore I wouldn't let anyone close enough to tear me up again." He paused, eyes lowering to their joined hands. "But I reckon some promises are meant to be broken." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they just sat there. Two people would pass heavy enough to crush them, letting the silence say what words couldn't. Then Colt stood, coming around to her side of the table. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing her cheek, gentle as a whisper. Her breath caught. When his lips touched hers, it was nothing like the desperate claiming Jeb had always taken. It was careful, steady, as if Colt was giving her the choice to take it or leave it. She didn't leave it. When they broke apart, the wind outside had died, and the whole ranch seemed to exhale with them. Chapter 8. A Home in the Sunset. Spring had begun to lay its gentle hand across the prairie, turning the grass from winter's gray to a faint, hopeful green. The days were warmer now, the wind carrying the scent of fresh earth and wild sage instead of frost. Clara may stood in the corral, watching Luke toddle through the soft dirt with the determined steps only a small child could manage. The colt, barely broken, stood patient nearby, ears flicking, as Luke reached out a chubby hand toward its muzzle. Clara smiled, her heart swelling at the sight. Months ago, she couldn't have imagined him laughing this freely, his little boots kicking up dust under the open sky. From the barn, Colt emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been repairing a broken gate latch all afternoon, but the moment he spotted her, his stride slowed. There was something in his gaze now, steady, sure, and warm in a way that made her stomach flutter. "Fence will hold another season," he said as he approached. She turned toward him, tucking a loose strand of hair under her bonnet. "You work harder than anyone I've ever met." His eyes flicked toward Luke. "Worth it." The word sat between them for a moment, full of weight. Miss Lila stepped out onto the porch, calling for Luke. The boy turned, grinning, and ran toward the house with the unsteady speed of a yearling calf. Once he was safely inside, Colt took another step closer to Clara. "Town's quieter these days," he said. "Folks finally stopped flapping their tongues." Clara tilted her head. Maybe they just got tired of waiting for a scandal that never came. Or maybe, Colt said, his voice low, they started seeing the truth. She studied him, the fading sunlight catching the hard lines of his face, softening them. "And what's that?" "That you belong here," he said simply. Her breath caught. For months she'd been afraid to believe it, afraid that one day the walls she'd built would crumble and she'd find herself back in the dark. But standing here, with Colt's eyes holding hers and the prairie stretching endless and open all around, she felt something she hadn't in years, safe. Colt reached for her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You and Luke, this place is yours as much as it's mine. You'll never have to run again, and you'll never cry here again." The words, those same words he'd spoken the day they met, hit her deeper now, because now she knew he meant every syllable. She smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. "Then I guess I'm home." They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of copper and gold. The windmill turned slow in the distance, the barn swayed with the low murmurs of the horses, and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. Clara leaned into him, his arms settling around her shoulders like it had always been meant to be there. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the future didn't scare her at all. The sun was melting into the horizon, setting the prairie ablaze in gold and crimson. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain, brushing past the weatherboards of Colt Lawson's porch. Horses snorted softly in the corral, their silhouettes dark against the firelit sky. Clara stood there, Luke asleep in her arms, watching the light fade. She'd thought she'd known endings, hard, jagged ones that left you hollow. But this felt different. Boot steps creaked across the porch, and then Colt was beside her, hat in hand, his gaze fixed on the same sunset. The lines of worry that had lived on his face for months were gone, replaced by something quieter, steadier. "It's over," he said softly. "For good this time." She looked at him, searching his eyes. "And what happens now?" Colt's lips curved into that rare, slow smile of his. "Now, we live. You, me, the boy. We make something worth keeping." Her chest ached in the best way. "You mean that?" "I've never meant anything more." He slipped his arm around her, pulling her close as the last light bled into night. The windmill turned slow and steady, the saloon's faint music drifting across the plains, and the first stars blinked awake overhead. "You'll never cry here again," he whispered. Clara leaned into him, her heart finally at rest. "Not as long as you're here." And under that vast, endless sky, they stood together, two souls who'd found their way home.